is to help Canadians get past that vibe session, because how Canadians feel really does have a real economic impact.
Canada was on the brink of an existential crisis, not one born of war or political collapse, but an economic one that seeped into every corner of life. For many, the rising cost of living was no longer just a temporary hardship, it was a relentless storm eroding the foundations of their daily lives. Essentials like food, housing, and transportation, once manageable expenses, now loomed as unattainable luxuries. Families found themselves making painful compromises, cutting corners where none existed, while seniors on fixed incomes watched their hard-earned stability crumble. The government's response to this widespread anxiety was met with a mix of skepticism and anger. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his administration had positioned themselves as champions of the middle class, yet their policies often felt disconnected from the realities on the ground. In a bold but controversial move, the government issued rebate checks to 19 million Canadians, a gesture framed as a lifeline but perceived by many as a band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound. At the heart of the controversy was Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, who had recently stood before the nation in a highly anticipated press conference. Her delivery, polished and deliberate, was meant to inspire confidence. Yet, as she spoke of vibe sessions and urged Canadians to adopt a more optimistic outlook on the economy, her words felt tone-deaf to those struggling to make ends meet. The suggestion that the country's woes could be alleviated by a shift in perception rather than substantive action was met with widespread derision. Social media erupted in outrage. Stories of financial struggle and frustration poured in from all corners of the country. Seniors living on pensions shared their fears of eviction, students burdened by debt expressed hopelessness about their futures, and families juggling multiple jobs recounted the exhaustion of endless sacrifice. The checks, while appreciated by some, were seen by others as a shallow attempt to buy goodwill without addressing the root causes of the crisis. The divide between government rhetoric and public reality was growing wider by the day. While Trudeau's administration touted Canada's relative economic stability compared to other G7 nations, these statistics did little to comfort those living paycheck to paycheck. For the average Canadian, these figures were abstract and impersonal, a far cry from the tangible struggles they faced. The opposition, led by figures like Jagmeet Singh of the NDP, seized on the discontent, labeling the government's policies as discriminatory and out of touch. Singh argued that the rebate program excluded the most vulnerable populations, non-working seniors, individuals with disabilities, and students, highlighting a glaring flaw in the Liberal Party's approach. Yet, even as Singh's critiques gained traction, his inability to present actionable alternatives left many questioning his effectiveness as a leader. For Trudeau, the growing chorus of dissatisfaction posed a significant challenge. His administration's reliance on performative gestures and surface-level solutions had left him vulnerable to accusations of prioritizing optics over outcomes. Freeland's concept of a vibe session became a symbol of this disconnect, a phrase that encapsulated the government's failure to grasp the severity of the challenges facing ordinary Canadians. As the political landscape grew more polarized, the stakes for Canada's future became increasingly clear. The question was no longer just about economic policy, it was about trust, leadership, and the very fabric of Canadian society. The stories of those left behind, the seniors skipping meals, the students drowning in debt, the families one paycheck away from disaster, became the silent backdrop to a nation grappling with its identity. The ripple effects of Canada's economic turmoil reached far beyond the individual struggles of its citizens. Small businesses, the backbone of many communities, were closing their doors at an alarming rate. In towns like Maple Ridge and Thunder Bay, once thriving main streets had become dotted with for-lease signs. The owners spoke of dwindling customers and skyrocketing operating costs that made survival impossible. Mary Gallagher, a bakery owner in Halifax, was one such casualty. For 15 years, she had woken up at 4 a.m. to prepare fresh bread and pastries for her loyal customers. But as ingredient prices soared and fewer people could afford her goods, she was forced to shut down. The bakery had been her dream, a place where neighbors gathered, birthdays were celebrated, and mornings began with the smell of freshly baked croissants. Now, the windows were boarded up, and Mary was left wondering what her future held. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said in an interview with a local paper. But when the government talks about helping small businesses, where is that help? The big corporations get tax breaks, and people like me? We're invisible. Mary's story was echoed across the country. Independent restaurants, family-run shops, and even mid-sized enterprises were feeling the squeeze. Many pointed to policies that seemed to favor larger players, leaving smaller businesses to fend for themselves. The housing crisis was another flashpoint in the growing discontent. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, rental prices had become so exorbitant that even professionals with stable incomes were struggling. For those on fixed or low incomes, finding affordable housing was becoming a near impossible task. Take the case of Amir and Layla Farzan, newcomers to Canada who had moved from Iran seeking safety and opportunity. With their 2 children, they lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Burnaby, paying over half their income in rent. Despite Amir working long hours as a delivery driver and Layla taking on part-time cleaning jobs, saving for a down payment on a home felt like an unattainable dream. Back home, we were always told Canada was a land of opportunity, Amir said. But no one tells you how hard it is to start over here. The rent eats everything. There's no chance to get ahead. These stories painted a grim picture of a nation at odds with its self-image. Canada had long been seen as a beacon of fairness, opportunity, and compassion. Yet the lived experiences of many Canadians told a different story, one of inequality, systemic neglect, and growing despair. In Ottawa, the Liberal government scrambled to manage the fallout. Trudeau's speeches increasingly emphasized unity and resilience, urging Canadians to have faith in the nation's institutions. Yes, these are challenging times, he declared in a recent address. But Canada has weathered storms before, and we will come through this stronger than ever. However, his words rang hollow for many. Critics argued that his administration's reliance on lofty rhetoric and symbolic gestures revealed a lack of concrete solutions. The rebate checks were a prime example. For some families, the $250 provided a brief respite, perhaps covering a portion of their grocery bill or an overdue utility payment. But for most, it was a drop in the bucket compared to the mounting pressures they faced. The opposition parties capitalized on this sentiment. Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives, painted Trudeau as an out-of-touch elite incapable of understanding the struggles of ordinary Canadians. His fiery speeches resonated with working-class voters, many of whom felt betrayed by a government that had promised to stand for them. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, meanwhile, continued to push for more inclusive policies, demanding additional support for seniors, students, and people with disabilities. Singh's charisma and passion made him a compelling voice for change, but his proposals often lacked the specificity needed to sway undecided voters. As the political discourse heated up, the average Canadian remained caught in the crossfire. For families like the Farzans, business owners like Mary Gallagher, and countless others struggling to make ends meet, the debates in Parliament felt distant and disconnected. The rising tension began to spill into the streets. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with demonstrators calling for action on housing, health care, and economic relief. In downtown Montreal, thousands gathered in a peaceful march, carrying signs that read, "We need real solutions and listen to the people." Similar scenes played out in Calgary, Winnipeg, and St. John's. For many, these protests were not just about economic policy, they were about reclaiming a sense of dignity and agency. The Canadian dream, once a source of hope and aspiration, had become a bitter irony for those left behind by systemic inequalities.